Morning, everyone. I'm Ashish Kausal, founder of Consciously Unbiased, a movement to build inclusion in the workplace, and CEO of diversity staffing firm Higher Talent. We have a very special guest today with us, Dr. Vijay Pandukar, a global talent and culture leader and former chief DEI officer at Dropbox. Today, we're here to discuss how the shifting DEI landscape and how to keep inclusion a priority in your workplace. Vijay's unique background as a published scholar of DEI, longtime university leader, and corporate C-level officer gives us a chance to look at some recent social phenomena and see how we can unpack what's happening, why it's important, and what are the implications of keeping DEI work alive in your organizations and how to make it the forefront of what we're doing today in society. Welcome, Vijay.
Thanks for having me, Ashish. It's nice to be here, and I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Definitely. Can we start out by you sharing why DEI is personally important to you?
Yeah, sure, of course. I really appreciate the chance to speak about this on a personal level. I think oftentimes, with work, whether it be in-house, full-time jobs I've had, or as a consultant, it's very technical, and I do think for most people I know that have a long career in DEI work, that there is a personal side to this work. It's rare that you would end up doing DEI work unless there's some kind of lived experience or personal story. I think for me, two touch points that I frequently come to when I think about my why of how I got into this work in the first place. First would be my parents being immigrants. My folks immigrated to North America in 1969 and 1971. And my sister and I grew up here as second generation Asian Americans, Desis, Indian Americans, depending on how you want to identify it. And growing up with immigrant parents, if anyone tuning in on the live stream knows, it's unbelievably formative, right? Navigating that biculturalism of having parents who didn't grow up in the society you're growing up in. And then we were fortunate enough to actually go to India quite a bit when I was growing up in the 80s, 1980s, 1990s. My sister and I went to India with my parents to South India and spent a lot of time with relatives and traveling around the countryside. And those experiences from my earliest memories caused a really productive cognitive and emotional dissonance for me, because we would leave Chicago in 1982, 1985, 1987, and we would go to rural, pre-industrial Indian villages where my family lived and experience an extraordinarily different lifestyle, an extraordinarily different rhythm of the day, way of spending time together, way of communicating, way of making food, way of traveling. And so from the time I was a little kid, I didn't have the presumption that there was a normal, because I was experiencing two radically altered norms. And, the only logical conclusion is that life is weird. And I think that life is weird and there is no normal are really good precepts to a career in DEI. And then on the flip side, another part of my journey, which probably isn't as much of a multicultural rainbow pot of sunshine, is growing up in the 1980s and 1990s as an Indian American child of immigrants at the northern edge of Chicago, right up against the Chicago-Evanston border, during a time of great pain in my community. The immediate neighborhood I lived in was low to moderate income, primarily Black. My elementary and middle schools were primarily Black. And this was a time when the Black community in American urban cities was hit heavily by the crack epidemic, by the loss of jobs, by the negative impact of Reaganomics on urban communities, and then the kind of criminally misaligned war on drugs, which was really just a war on poor communities in the urban setting, and the rise of mass incarceration. And in a number of really powerful and personal ways, I experienced violence and despair and hopelessness in Chicago at that time. And the other thing that occurred to me as a young person coming of age in that space is life isn't fair. This is not fair. Kids I'd grown up with that were great, smart, hardworking, were in impossible circumstances. And so the two kind of early convictions I had were, there is no normal, and life isn't fair. And I think those are two great vectors to have a life of doing work around the greater purpose of inclusion in human dignity.
Can I ask you one more question around that?
Yeah, sure.
So I grew up in Connecticut, and when I would go to India, people would call me American, and when I go to school in Connecticut, they would call me Indian. And I think I probably identified more as an American than an Indian just because I grew up here, right? And so you kind of got the sense that you really didn't belong in either place fully. So how did you feel that same way, and how did you handle that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Ashish, if you and I had met when I was like a teenager or in college, I was definitely struggling with this sense of dislocation and feeling deeply otherized in the United States due to experiences I was having. I remember pretty much every year I was in college, somebody who I knew, like who had been in a group project with or taken a class with, would at the end of weeks of working together would compliment me on my English. So you have these like staggering moments where you're like, wait, of course my English is the way it is, or I grew up here, right? But in their eyes, I was perpetually foreign. But then because I had the experience of traveling to India and being reminded over and over and over again that I wasn't really Indian, particularly in a pre-globalized India, right, in the 80s and 90s, where I think some of these polarities were more exacerbated. I knew there was no mythical, like, well, if I could just go to India, I would fit in, because I knew that wasn't the case based on feedback from my uncles, aunts, and cousins. And so, yeah, absolutely. I think that part of what it means for many Asian Americans, particularly who grew up in the 20th century, was to feel homeless in a way, right? Neither Asian nor American, and our sense making and journey around that is one of the things that binds us, right? If you get a bunch of Asian American folks from my generation into a room, there's a lot of good humor and gallows humor around experiences we've had, trying to figure out how do we locate ourselves in a place that's oftentimes telling us we're not welcome or we're just misunderstood.
Absolutely. Now, the DEI landscape's been really changing, especially this year. I think many of us have been watching the financial implications for Bud Light in the last few months. And why do you think the backlash is so strong right now? And how are you understanding what's happening in this anti-woke moment?
Oh yeah, the DEI landscape is changing fast. That's for sure. Hard to understate that, Ashish. I think that something that I think when I look at, like, you mentioned Bud Light, you mentioned the sort of anti-woke backlash or anti-DEI backlash. One thing that I find myself talking about with friends and colleagues and family a lot that I think is really missing from the moment by moment clickbaity news understanding of this struggle, first and foremost, is that we have to look at what's happening right now through the longer historical lens. Otherwise, you're actually not going to read the chessboard correctly. And so the contestation between people, regular people, and corporations around who matters and who gets to be marketed to and who gets to be hired and who is promoted and who is valued, that's a struggle that's playing out in some really, really painful ways right now. But it's actually part of a much longer struggle, right? So I think it's really important to see this as what you could call popularly the American civil rights story, or more accurately, just a fundamental wrestling with who gets to have full human dignity in this society from day one. Whether you say day one is 1609, or whether you say day one is 1776, or whether you say day one is 1955 or 1968, day one starts at different times depending on when you're looking at the history. But the through line in American history, as someone who has multiple degrees in American civil rights history, right? Like the through line is that the question of pursuit of liberty and pursuit of happiness has been decided in really limited and unfair ways, based on who gets to be fully human and who gets to have a dignified experience. So this notion that we should punish a corporation for celebrating a set of identities or marketing to a group is both atrocious on face, but also not surprising, because it's just part of the long multi-century arc of trying to figure out how we expand the pie of human dignity in a society that was designed inherently from the start to limit those privileges and gifts to a few. On the flip, though, second answer, this specific moment that in a very what's happening right now around going after corporations is sort of historically unique, right? So after I said it's historically universal, let me be the classic academic here and say it's also historically unique. What's unique is the weapons that are being used to try and hold corporations accountable. That toolbox is growing in terms of the folks who are trying to change the chessboard, right? So you're seeing some measurable impact in terms of revenue and market cap for some corporations that are being targeted, and that is emboldening folks that are mobilized around these issues to look for more corporate victims, to call out, and to then use Twitter and to use other social media platforms to say, let's stop buying Pop-Tarts because they are supporting whatever agenda. And it's been a long time since there was a successful consumer mobilization that actually hit a multinational corporation in the way that this Bud Light thing played out, right? So I think it's worth taking notice there. The other piece that is not getting as much news attention that I think is important for people who really care about this work or who are doing this work to understand is that aside from the social media clamor and, don't buy this product or don't buy that product, there's actually a number of lawsuits that are being enacted, right? Through what are called shareholder litigation. These are shareholder litigation lawsuits.
Yeah.
And special interest groups that oppose diversity, equity, and inclusion are using nonprofits as heat shields to buy stock in corporations, and then as shareholders raise the claim that there's fiduciary conflict of interest in DEI efforts. And on this piece, I think that the public is oftentimes unaware or miseducated. And we have a moment right now in this scrum to actually clear this up, because the notion that corporations are breaking the law through their DEI efforts, one, is unproven, but two, anybody who's working in a corporate space knows that when you go to do things, you work closely with your legal team to roll out your policies around talent acquisition and talent branding, to roll out your employee development and talent development strategies, right? So a mature corporation isn't violating EEO precepts or EEO laws with its DEI program. And the claim that there's laws being broken or that there's a fiduciary conflict of interest here around DEI it's meant to be chilling litigation that convinces corporations to bail on DEI before a case is even proven, right? And unfortunately, I think that it is having a meaningful effect. And I just want to remind audiences that last week, a federal judge tossed out the Starbucks lawsuit, right, which is one of these spurious, lawsuits brought through the shareholder channel to say that that the board of trustees and the C-suite at Starbucks have a fiduciary obligation to back off of DEI because it's not in the best interest of shareholders. And a federal judge said that the claim that there is a fiduciary conflict of interest is not merited. So we're not going to pursue this case. And I think that the dismissal of that case hopefully gives us early signal on the other cases that are upcoming and should be shut down.
So I'm going to mention two things from that you kind of triggered in my head. So there's one of the greatest investors of all time, Bill Gurley, talked about last week about regulation and Citizens United and the need to disband that ability to hide behind shields and make these public policy issues without standing forward and stepping up and saying who you are. So that's number one, I think, that needs to happen. Number two is, you talked about fiduciary responsibility and these lawsuits. The reality is businesses are in the business of making money, and their fiduciary responsibility is to track as much of the consumer they can, whether they're black, white, green, red, right? And so these lawsuits are basically they're contradictory to what they're saying they need to do, right? Because you need to build the biggest customer base and hire the best candidates. And I think that'll die. And I also think that you're seeing this just like in our lifetime, gay rights, or gay marriage was a huge issue 10 years ago. And there's all these politicians and ads running around we can't do this. This is not right. Blah blah blah. It just, when you get to the tipping point of societal change, that resistance really happens quite dramatically. And I think that's what we're seeing today. But the train's already left the station. I don't think you're going to reverse any of this stuff at this point.
Well, I hope you're right, Ashish.
It may be painful, but I think like the reality is that the population, like, we've procreated at a level where there's really no majority, at least in the long term. So you're going to have to deal with this, because there's a lot of buyers for that you're leaving off the table if you don't. So, but however, in that same vein, in higher education, we're seeing legislation banning DEI offices and even courses at public institutions in some of the largest states in the country, such as Florida and Texas, where you are, rolling back in part because diversity amplifies divisions, right? And so what do you think this means for higher education? And is that statement right? Does diversity amplify divisions?
Oh boy. I mean, first, I roll all the eye rolls that I can possibly muster here around this notion that diversity amplifies divisions. So, like, when you said, hey, look, the train's already left the station, I think that I understand that sentiment, but the minute you shift to the higher education or the K-12 space, I think we have some pretty serious concerns to look at here, because it may be possible to reverse the directionality of those trains. There, state after state, we're seeing conservative legislatures pass laws that are effectively rolling back the clock in terms of what's happening in the educational space. I want to comment on two things before I get to your sense of, does diversity amplify division?
Sure.
One, just in case the audience isn't as familiar with what's happening in the higher education space, there's an attempt to actually look at what's being taught, right? There's a curricular censoring going on here. And you can see this in the attempt to enact book bannings and pull books out of libraries in certain states. That's not necessarily on college campuses, but you're also starting to see the effect of the attempt to pass legislation that looks at public universities and what courses can be offered as part of the general education, right? So there's legislation to say if there's a course labeled DEI, then it can't be part of Gen Ed. And what the conservative groups that have really skillfully put together this legislation in think tanks are going after is the connection between general education coursework, which all students have access to take and have to attain some number of credits in on their way to a baccalaureate degree, and the connection between taking these courses and the sense that you may get exposed to the reality that American life is actually segmented by identity-based experiences, and that whatever slice of that life you look at, whether you're taking a gender studies class or an American history class on history of slavery, that it actually may sensitize you to the notion that we are not yet a meritocracy, and therefore we need to put the finger on the scale of justice. And the fastest way that you could potentially try and remove that sensitization effect would be to sanitize, or to not even sanitize, to actually make the general education curriculum counterfactual. If you want to be generally educated, as the curriculum is called, then you actually need to know about the reality of how these identities bear out in American life. And there's plenty of data to reinforce this. This isn't just people's opinions. So there's an attempt to actually change the curricular experience on college campuses through legislation. On the flip side, there already is effective legislation that is shutting down DEI centers and roles on college campuses in Florida, in Texas, in Ohio, in Arkansas. You're seeing a chain, a domino effect here of these package legislations catching on in more conservative states that are saying we need to remove these DEI centers from college campuses. And this gets to your question about division, right? And the thing is, if you're not familiar with what these centers actually do, then it may be easy to get misled into saying, wait, why are there DEI centers on college campuses? First, there generally aren't DEI centers on college campuses. The same way that they're really, so the centers that you have on college campuses are best understood as sites of belonging and support for students that are deeply underrepresented in the collegiate experience. So if you're on a college campus and we expect all students to be able to do the best work of their lives on these campuses, then these identity-based centers are places where you can go for 30 minutes, an hour, and when you get a break during your week, and be in a physical space where you feel seen and understood and supported, where you're normal. And the whole social psychology or organizational psychology research around this is that all people need some places in their life where they feel normal and understood and supported in order to be brave, courageous, resilient, and effective in the rest of their life. Right. So this is, we got to take it out of the political milieu here and just understand this around normal human psychology. Right. People need spaces where they feel supported and understood in order to be resilient in the rest of the places. And the core function of these identity and cultural support centers, first and foremost, right, the prime directive, to quote Star Trek, is to actually offer a site of belonging so that an LGBTQ student or a student veteran or a student with disabilities or a student of color can actually go in, recharge their batteries, and then the vast majority of their time is not spent in those sites, right? The vast majority of the time is spent in spaces where you may be the only, right? Where you're weathering constantly having to navigate a pretty frictional terrain of what it means to be seen and normal. And these identity centers are places to pull over and recharge your battery. And to undo them under the guise that DEI is divisive is really a blow to persistence and graduation for marginalized and vulnerable populations. And because we know college has an economic multiplier, a baccalaureate degree is a pathway to social mobility for historically excluded and marginalized groups, there's a real risk here when we undo some of these DEI supports that college admissions doesn't equal college graduation. And a part of a baccalaureate degree doesn't really help you that much.
No, 100%. I also think that like basic human behavior, like you're going to college and it's going to be a mentally stressful environment because you're learning and it's going to push you to learn as much as you can. And it's not easy, right? And so the part of what everyone needs to be able to handle that is a sense of home, right? And so these centers, whether there's also, I'm sure there's like majority centers as well that people like, you still feel like you need a sense of home to reset to be able to handle the stress that you're about to go through, right? And so I think it's just basic needs,
And the more majoritized you are in any organizational culture, right? Let's get out of the college campus thing here, right? So the more majoritized you are, the easier it is to find that sense of home.
Yeah.
Because you and your ways of knowing and being and moving and interacting are normalized in the organizational culture. So even when we think about corporations, right? For me as somebody who's led in corporate environments, part of what we have to talk about is how employees come to a strong sense of belonging. We know that genuine sense of belonging is positively correlated with employee retention, employee performance, right? Team success. And so when we think about the differential terrain of belonging in complex organizations, it holds true for corporations as well. We actually have to support different communities differently in order to achieve belonging, because some people have an easier on-ramp because the way they are is the majority way in the organization.
And I still think there's this, for some reason, people think that every decision is about them, right? Like, so whether I need to go to this center to relax is not a diss on anyone else, right? So it's not about you. Like, that's the reality, is that we got to stop thinking it's about us, right?
Yeah, and it doesn't take anything away from you, right? For me to get fed, what is that actually taking away from you, right? And the fastest way to gain support for dismantling DEI is to convince people that DEI is taking away something from you. And this branding, this packaging of DEI as divisive is a strategic tactic cooked up in a think tank, right? Let's be clear, as none of this is random or organic. This is artificial and manufactured. Because if you can position this as simply divisive, then even cool-headed moderates might be like, well, I don't want divisive, right? And it's like, can we dig under the surface a little bit here and actually get into the specifics, right?
Mhm.
And so if you're shutting down an LGBTQ resource center,
Mhm.
what are the majority of the calories of that center actually going to do? Oh, support queer students at the margins so that they can get the help they need to graduate. What does that have to do with division? What is that taking away from you, right? And so I do think it's important to ground these conversations in some of the objective truth and the structural reality.
Absolutely. What do you think about the concept of America not having a racial majority by 2045?
You and me have talked about this before, right? Ashish, I just want to shout out. There's some great comments in the comment feed here, and so I've tried to keep one eye on the comment thread.
Okay.
And Quinn, the tie-in to ERGs, right? So it's such an analog. If you think about sites of belonging in collegiate learning environments and sites of belonging in corporate organizational structures, absolutely, ERGs are such an important mechanism for evening out the topography of belonging in corporations. So yeah, this notion that America will be potentially majority not white, right? Let's name the language more precisely by 2045. Um, I think that this gets floated by demographers, and it's an important statistic to look at if you're an enrollment manager in a university. It's an important statistic to understand if you are in consumer goods or retail or hospitality, and you're looking at the nature of consumer diversity and trying to make sure that you build and sell products and experiences that are calibrated to consumer desires and wants and needs. So it is salient and it is meaningful. And I think where there's major slippage is when we talk about a majority minority America as a solution to power dynamics, right? To civil rights struggle.
Yeah.
Population is not the same thing as power. And if you look at the post-colonial world, if you look at the equatorial belt,
Yeah.
there's myriad examples of countries where a small racial minority runs the country. So, just because America may actually tip into being majority not white doesn't change the power dynamics. And the power dynamics are more meaningful than the population dynamics in terms of controlling the things that lead to an equitable and dignified life, like access to fair housing and schools and clean food and healthcare, right? I mean, some of the fundamental human dignity premises. The high school completion pipeline in America became majority minority in 2014.
Mhm.
So in 2014, more than 50% of high school completers in America were not white.
Yeah.
And that number has just gotten more and more and more majority minority. What did that change in terms of power dynamics in our society?
Nothing.
Right. So I do think that, yes, it matters, and there's limits to how much it matters because population doesn't equal power.
Yeah. I also think so my concept of what school should be, or at least college should be, is it teaches you how to, not necessarily the content itself, it teaches you how to think, right, logically, and gives you a framework around that. That's what the 4 years is for. And the second thing is it teaches you how to interact with people that may be different than you, right? Because when you go into corporate America, you're not going to meet everyone who's similar to you. So you have to learn how to socially integrate yourself into different situations and still get what you need done. And I like that whole affirmative action thing is interesting to me because you're saying that colleges can't carry kids to be ready for life. You're going to put them in a situation where they're at a disadvantage and they walk in because you're not letting them replicate what corporate America looks like within their communities. And number two is if you get rid of the affirmative action sorts of pieces, and you're going to get rid of sort of any angle that somebody has to get into a school. If you're going to be consistent, be consistent. Don't be consistently inconsistent, right? So then people who have alumni that used to go there should not have any angle to get in either.
Yeah, and I mean, I do think we are going to see more litigation around legacy admissions, which, hey, I would fully support the end of legacy admissions. I think that athletics is going to get a fair amount of scrutiny, athletic admissions, particularly at the elites. Yeah, I mean, I think, Ashish, this is a bit of a rabbit hole, and it's actually a very complicated issue in terms of what the racial checkbox means on a college admissions application. But I do think for the audience at hand, there's a lot you can read. There's other podcasts you can tune into to listen to about this. But I think the one thing I'll say on this topic is that the elimination of race in admissions criteria is only the first intended step, because the next they're teeing up trigger legislation to go after potentially minority serving equity programs that actually wrap a set of empowerment services around historically marginalized communities that allow them not just to matriculate into college, but then persist through graduation. So this is there's no one and done. We're at the tip of the iceberg. And if these are issues you care about, this is a time to become more engaged and more vocal and active in pushing back, because it's not done.
Yeah, I just saw Larry Summers speak at the All In podcast, and he's a podcast summit. Sorry, and he's the former one of the great economic minds of our generation, and he's also the former president of Harvard. And he's like, we need to get rid of legacy programs, and we need to get rid of early admission, and those are the only ways to sort of fix some of those things. But he says it's not going to stop here, so we're going to probably go into the corporate universe. And so, speaking of that, you've seen a lot of chief diversity officers leave, especially your peers and including yourself, that are high profile. What do you think the impact of this is going to be on DEI? And then do you think hiring chief diversity officers is the answer to making DEI a priority, or is there another way to structure it within the workplace that is embodied across the entire company?
Sure. I think this question's getting kicked around a lot as a sort of a popular media football topic right now. And what's a useful additive in this discourse is actually a mental model on why you have a head of DEI or a DEI leader in a complex organization. So let me start there before I opine on any of the particulars, because I think that this is actually where there's more value.
Sure.
So, there's these polarities where you can think of an organization as bringing on a DEI leader in order to solve the problem. And that never solves the problem if you do not have broad awareness and commitment to DEI as a business imperative and simply a way of being relevant in a 21st century world across the company, right? So it's got to be broadly held. Otherwise, no DEI leader or DEI team can do the work successfully. And I think that's understood. On the flip side, there's this chatter around, well, the best move is to not have a DEI leader and to make sure that the DEI commitment is broadly held, right? And people will phrase this as, everyone needs to be the chief diversity officer, and therefore you don't need to have the chief diversity officer. And this is patently nonsense, because
everyone should be managers. You don't need managers then.
Well, exactly, right. And everyone should be the CFO and the COO and the CLO, right? I mean, it's a fundamental misunderstanding of what a DEI leader is there to do. What I do agree that everyone should have broad awareness and commitment to DEI, but the role of a DEI leader and a DEI team is actually to bring expertise around operational design and iteration. It's not to evangelize the why of DEI. If you bring in a DEI leader to evangelize the why, they're already set up to fail. The why needs to be bought into. A DEI team is there to have deep expertise in the operational maturity and evolution of DEI in a complex organization relevant to that sector and context, so that you're 0 to 1 of DEI, setting up your first ERGs, building your first emphasis in DEI and talent acquisition and talent brand, doing your first DEI hypo equity development programs, those kinds of things. A lot of companies get those things set up without DEI assets in place, because a really well-intentioned and aware and committed people operations team can do it without DEI assets in place. What's really hard to do is to actually steer those assets up the maturity curve without having DEI leadership, right? So good DEI leaders, and look, there's variance in quality in any talent pool, right? But a good DEI leader is actually there to bring operational rigor, iterative design, to close the theory to practice gap by bringing in the newest research on how to do this work effectively, and then localizing and contextualizing that research within the company or organizational context, right? And the DEI leader and team is really there in order to affect a maturation of things that could theoretically be set up by the people ops team or just the business themselves. And I think that mental model is oftentimes missing from the discourse, because honestly, it just hasn't been articulated very well as to what the DEI center of excellence is actually there to do.
So you've left now, and a lot of these leaders have left. What are you doing to help organizations now continue this path forward? Like, what's your skill set that you're bringing to the table now that you're outside the organization to help companies that may want this today?
Yeah, Ashish, for audience members, Ashish is mentioning that a recent transition of mine from being in-house, whether in-house as a campus-based leader at large, complex campuses around the country, to being in-house as chief diversity officer at Zynga or VMware or Dropbox. And in what I'm doing in this season of my career, who knows where we'll be in the future, but in this season, I'm trying to actually add value by being able to partner with multiple organizations. And so the way that I work with organizations, for example, I have a organization where I'm going into the leadership team offsite at the start of October to work with the leadership team on retooling the managers so that they can actually manage intact teams towards psychological safety, genuine sense of belonging, and team connection as 3 key variables for unlocking peak performance, right? So that's a service that I can provide an organization that's looking to position their managers beyond task management or OKR management or revenue management, right? I also am, I do organizational strategy consulting. So I'm doing a long-term organizational strategy partnership with one of the largest tech companies in the world right now to work with the DEI team over the next 8 months to look at how to move from what in a maturity model would be called programmatic or HR-led DEI into design thinking or agile DEI. So how do we actually create the muscle and the capacity to test and iterate and scale in a way that models the product development cycle in a tech company, so that DEI can move up the maturity scale out of some of the constraints of the more antiquated programmatic style of DEI. So there's so many different ways to add value for large organizations and small. The third way is just with individuals. I coach as an executive coach. I coach individual leaders on their acumen in leading diverse teams that are distributed globally towards better performance by helping those leaders kind of gain self-awareness, emotional intelligence, and the dynamism necessary to successfully lead teams in the future of work, where your team may be on 4 continents and you only get to see them once a year if you're lucky. I actually just talked a lot about this in a Super Managers podcast that dropped today, so shameless self-plug for the other part of my work.
So I also wanted to sort of pull the audience, if you're interested and you like this conversation that we've been having. We're thinking about together creating a Chief Diversity Council where we talk quarterly about interesting issues that are happening across corporate America. And so if you'd like to join Vijay and I'd definitely have you reach out to us for that. This has been super insightful. I always like to end our LinkedIn lives with this idea around microprogressions. It's ways to get people to change behavior at work, and you have to make it a personal passion, right? And so what's one action step or microprogression, as we call them at Conscious and Bias, that will help people change their behavior at work?
Microprogression. Check it out, y'all. This is an Ashish Kaushal special here. I like the microprogression. Let's see, what's a microprogression that I can help evangelize? Look, I completely agree. You got to make it personal. Here's something that is extraordinarily basic, yet that's highly relevant in a inherently complex world. I'll go back to Dr. Hazel Simonet introduced me to this concept when I was probably 21 or 22 years old at the University of Wisconsin. We cannot be part of the movement for inclusion if we unconsciously treat everyone around us the way we want to be treated. If we operate on golden rule thinking, then we are going to fail in the promise of meaningful inclusion, because people actually want to be treated very differently depending on what they need. Mm-hmm. And so the unspoken guidance of treat others how you want to be treated is not as helpful as treat others as how they want to be treated. So if I was going to leave you with one micro progression, it's, write it on a Post-it note, stick it on the side of your monitor, print it up, tape it on your office wall, right? But the platinum rule challenges you to treat others how they want to be treated. And the easiest way to get there, because sometimes I'll bring this up with groups and they'll be like, yeah, but how would I ever know how people want to be treated? And here's the big reveal. You ask them, right? So I was just meeting with somebody I'm going to be doing some long-term work with on earlier this week. And one of the things I said to her is, hey, what kind of behaviors from teammates help you do the best work of your life? And one, I framed it in a novel way. I didn't say, how do you like to be treated? Which can be a bit awkward, right? But like, what kinds of behaviors, what communication styles allow you to flourish, right? Like allow you to be a badass at work. And what I got back from her was really useful behavioral and tactical guidance on her being an internal processor and the way she shows up in meetings and how helpful it is to have a heads up with 3 bullets ahead of time, because in the moment ideation is not a strength for her. But if she gets a little bit of a sneak preview, she can bring her A game. And already there, I know to not treat her how I would want to be treated, because in the moment ideation is something that works really well for me. But by asking the question, I was able to get clean signal on what she needs to flourish at work. So that's what I'll leave your audience with, a micro progression of the platinum rule.
I love it. Thank you so much. I hope we do this again. And I hope
Absolutely. It's been a lot of fun.
Absolutely. And so if people want to reach you, how do they get to you? That's the last question.
Right now, the fastest way to find me is on LinkedIn. My name is Vijay Pendakur, and I would love to engage with you. Friend me, link me, DM me, and let's continue the conversation.
All right. Thank you, sir.
All right. Take care.
You too.